Janet wasn't looking for secrets. She just wanted her reusable grocery bags from the trunk. That was it. But when she popped open the back of her husband's car, she spotted something that didn't belong. A thick manila folder, sticking halfway out of an old canvas briefcase Thomas hadn't used in years. Curious, she tugged it free. Inside were campaign flyers. Not just mock-ups or doodles, real glossy printouts. They had Thomas's name across the top in bold navy letters, framed by an image of him smiling in a tailored blazer. Below it read, "It's time for grown-up leadership. Vote Thomas Marshall, City Council." Janet stood there for a full minute, heart suddenly pounding, her mind racing through every conversation they'd had over the past few weeks. Nothing. No mention of City Council. No meetings. No hints. Just casual retirement talk and dinner debates over local news, always from the sidelines. She picked up another flyer. There was a photo she had never seen before. Thomas at the farmer's market, shaking hands with the mayor, looking like a man with a plan. Except he hadn't said a word. When Thomas got home that evening, Janet was sitting at the kitchen table with the folder in front of her, hands clasped. She didn't greet him, just watched his face the moment he saw what was waiting for him. He froze in the doorway. "Hi," she said evenly. "Have a good meeting?" He hesitated. Yeah, just, grabbed coffee with some folks." "Campaign volunteers?" she asked, tilting her head. "Or is that for a surprise birthday party I didn't know about?" He stepped into the room slowly, rubbing the back of his neck like he did when caught. "Janet, I was going to tell you." "When?" she said, voice calm but cutting. "Before or after the election?" "I wasn't hiding it," he started. "You printed flyers, with slogans, without saying a word to me. That's not a secret. That's a campaign launch." Thomas sighed. I didn't want to drag you into something if you weren't interested. You've said it yourself. You're done with politics. I'm done with other people's lies and power games. I never said I was done caring." He sat across from her slowly. "I've been thinking about this for months," he said. "The way things are going in the community, the budget cuts, the silence around infrastructure problems, the way people are ignored if they're over 50, it's not right. And I thought, maybe I could do something, just once." Janet stared at him. "You didn't think your wife, who spent 30 years covering local government, who wrote the exposé that got 2 city managers fired, might have something to say about that?" Thomas looked down. "I thought maybe you were happy being done. Finally resting." Janet's jaw clenched. She remembered what it felt like the day she turned in her press badge, the day she walked out of the newsroom, not because she wanted to, but because the new editor thought her style was too confrontational and her age didn't match the digital rebrand. She hadn't felt done. She had felt dismissed. Now here was her husband, launching a political campaign in secret, assuming she'd want no part of it. She rose from the table and left the folder behind. "I'm going to bed," she said quietly. "Good luck with your campaign, Thomas." And with that, she walked upstairs, feeling more awake than she had in years. Janet didn't sleep much that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing Thomas move around downstairs long after midnight. Normally, his footsteps were familiar and comforting. But now, every creak of the floorboards felt like a gap widening between them. She wasn't angry because he wanted to run for office. She was angry because he hadn't believed she'd care. And maybe, somewhere deep down, she was angry because he had something to wake up for again. And she didn't. The next morning was quiet. Thomas poured his coffee. Janet buttered her toast. They moved around each other like two professionals sharing a workspace they hadn't signed up for. He finally spoke. "I didn't mean to shut you out." She didn't look up. "You didn't shut me out. You just walked into something without me." He hesitated. "I was afraid you'd say no." Now she looked at him. "You were afraid I'd say no to you, or to the version of you who wants to feel important again?" Thomas blinked, caught off guard. "I'm not doing this for ego." "Then why didn't you tell me?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, almost too softly, "Because I didn't want to be talked out of it." Janet stood. "I would never talk you out of something you believe in," she said, "but I might have helped you do it right." She grabbed her keys and walked out before she said something she'd regret. She didn't have a plan, just a direction. She drove to the local park, the one with the walking loop where she used to interview local politicians during her reporting days. As she walked the trail, memories flooded back. Her first big article. The night she stayed up writing while Thomas cooked her pasta at 1 a.m. The way her heart used to race when she uncovered a truth no one else dared to print. She missed that woman. She missed herself. Later that afternoon, Janet found herself hovering by the door of Thomas's office. The door was cracked open. Inside, he was rehearsing a speech in front of a mirror. His words were clunky, stiff. He sounded more like a nervous teacher than a candidate. She pushed the door open. He stopped mid-sentence. "I'm not here to fight," she said. I heard your speech." He winced. "It's a work in progress. It sounds like a resume, not a reason." He looked at her, cautious but hopeful. "Want to help me fix it?" Janet didn't answer right away. But she walked into the room, picked up the notepad on his desk, and crossed out the first 3 lines of the speech. "Start here," she said, tapping a line near the bottom. "When you talk about the neighbor who lost her bus route, that's real. That's where you start." Thomas nodded slowly. "Okay." She set the pen down and turned to leave. He called after her. "Janet." She paused. "I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Not just of your judgment. I was afraid you'd remind me I'm not good enough to pull this off." She looked back at him, eyes softer now. "Then you really don't know me at all." That night, she found herself opening her old laptop for the first time in months. The screen flickered to life, dim and dusty. But her fingers knew what to do. She started drafting a revised version of Thomas's speech. And without realizing it, she was back in the world she thought she'd left behind. Not because of him, but because something in her was waking up. Something that had been quiet for far too long. The next week passed like a slow-burning fire. Janet told herself she wasn't getting involved. She was just helping shape a few words, giving feedback, polishing. That was it. But every evening, she found herself drawn to Thomas's desk, or scribbling notes on the backs of receipts while cooking dinner. She rearranged paragraphs in her mind while folding laundry. And by Friday, she had rewritten the entire campaign kickoff speech. Thomas stood at the podium that Saturday morning in front of a small crowd gathered outside the community center. The folding chairs were half filled with neighbors, city workers, and a few curious reporters. Janet stood near the back, arms crossed, heart thudding as if it were her name on the sign behind him. Thomas cleared his throat. He began, not with his resume, but with the story of a woman named Maria who'd waited 45 minutes for a city bus that never came. He talked about forgotten streets, rising costs, and how leadership isn't about being loud, it's about listening. The crowd leaned in. By the time he closed with, "At 62, I'm not running because I need a title. I'm running because I've lived long enough to know what matters," the audience burst into applause. Janet felt it, the energy, the impact, the return. That night, Thomas found her in the kitchen, glass of wine in one hand, speech notes in the other. "I couldn't have done that without you," he said. She smirked. "You shouldn't have tried to." He walked over, hesitated. "Would you consider coming to the strategy meeting next week?" Janet hesitated, swirling the wine in her glass. "I'm not running your campaign, Thomas." "I know. But I'll sit in," she said. "As an observer." He smiled. "As long as you bring that red pen." She didn't admit it, but the thought made her pulse quicken. At the first meeting, she sat in the corner while a fresh-faced 20-something walked the team through their social media strategy. He stumbled through jargon, overused buzzwords, and ended by suggesting they buy a few thousand followers to boost visibility. Janet raised her hand. Everyone turned. "Or," she said, "you could try real engagement. Local stories, issue-based posts, something authentic. Believe it or not, voters over 50 do know how to scroll." There was a pause. Then someone laughed. Another nodded. Thomas smiled wide. And just like that, Janet was in. By the following week, she was editing press releases, crafting messaging, and advising on debate strategy. She even reopened her old journalist contact list and started sending feelers to former colleagues. People began calling her Mrs. Marshall, then quickly correcting themselves to Janet once they realized she was the one steering the narrative. It was intoxicating. Not the attention. Janet had never cared for fame. What lit her up was purpose, structure, influence. One night, she stayed up until 2 a.m. drafting a statement about local zoning corruption. Thomas woke up, found her typing in the living room, and said, "You're glowing." She didn't respond, but her fingers didn't stop moving. What had started as curiosity was now momentum. And Janet, for the first time in years, felt like a woman in motion again. By mid-October, Janet was no longer just helping. She was the campaign's center of gravity. Reporters called her before they called Thomas. Volunteers asked her which neighborhoods to canvass. Even the digital team, once skeptical of her old-school instincts, now waited for her approval before posting anything online. At first, Thomas teased her. "You know you're the one people think is running, right?" She'd roll her eyes. "Only because I'm the one keeping you from putting your foot in your mouth." But they both knew. This campaign was no longer just his, it was theirs. Janet hadn't planned it that way. She'd promised herself boundaries, a toe in the water, not a full dive. But purpose has a way of pulling you under, especially when it's tied to something personal. And this was personal, not just the city or the issues, but what it meant to matter again, to be needed, to use the voice she'd tucked away for too long. Still, with power came pressure. One Thursday morning, Thomas received an anonymous envelope in their mailbox. Inside was a glossy flyer from the opponent's campaign, suggesting Thomas had once voted to slash public library funding when he was on the school board in the 90s. It was a lie, but a sticky one. Easy to misunderstand, harder to explain in a soundbite. The team was panicking, Thomas was frustrated, but Janet, she was calm. She dug into old archives, pulled up original budget notes from a report she'd written over 2 decades ago, and drafted a scathing rebuttal. The next day, she published a personal essay in the local paper titled, "I Was There." Here's what really happened. It went viral in the city's small digital bubble. Suddenly, people weren't just listening to Thomas, they were quoting Janet. And that's when the calls started. A podcast host, a former state senator, a local women's leadership coalition. They all wanted to hear from the woman behind the movement. Janet declined most of them. She wasn't ready to step into the spotlight. Not yet, but something inside her had shifted. At a town hall event the following week, Thomas stumbled during a heated exchange with a constituent. The woman, mid-40s, sharp, clearly frustrated, challenged him on housing policy. Thomas froze, fumbled, looked out at the crowd. Janet stood up. "I wrote that section of the platform," she said, voice steady, "and I'd be happy to walk you through the numbers." The room turned. Thomas stepped back without hesitation. Janet stepped forward. She didn't shout, she didn't spin. She spoke clearly, like she had 100 times in the newsroom, laying out facts, acknowledging limitations, offering ideas. When she finished, the room was silent for a breath, then broke into applause. Later that night, Thomas poured her a glass of wine and said, "You know, if you ever wanted to run," she shook her head. "Don't push your luck." He grinned. "Just saying, you still know how to command a room." She took the glass, clinked it gently against his. "I didn't lose that," she said. "I just forgot where I left it." They sat together in quiet satisfaction. And for the first time in years, Janet didn't feel like someone whose best chapters were behind her. She felt like a woman still being written. The calm didn't last. 3 weeks before the election, a campaign donation came in that sent a chill through Janet's spine. $50,000, an enormous sum for a city council race, wired in from a development firm with a polished name and a reputation that, to the public, sounded clean. But Janet recognized it immediately. They'd been the subject of one of her exposés years ago, accused of lobbying for zoning exceptions that displaced working-class families and greenlit luxury complexes with no affordable units. She brought the paperwork straight to Thomas. "Tell me you didn't approve this." He looked up from his notes, confused. "What?" "This donation, Fairhaven Strategies, it's them. You know who they are." He took the paper, scanned it, and his face dropped. "I had no idea. I thought they were a logistics firm. Rob from finance said." "I don't care what Rob said," she snapped. "We can't keep this money. If this hits the press, we'll look like hypocrites." Thomas rubbed his temples. "Janet, we're barely scraping by. That money could get us a real ad spot, staff, overtime, mailers. We're too close to stop now." "We're not stopping," she said, "but we're not selling our credibility either." He stood, frustration rising. "You're acting like this is still the newsroom. This is politics." "And that gives you permission to compromise?" she shot back. "I thought this campaign was about integrity. Wasn't that your whole speech? Time for grown-up leadership?" Grown-ups say no to dirty money, Thomas. He paced, jaw clenched. If we give it back, we lose ground. Maybe the whole race. She stared at him, and her voice softened, but not her resolve. Then we lose clean, or we win honest, but we don't sell ourselves on the way to either. Silence stretched between them. Then Thomas sat down, head in his hands. Okay, he said, we return it. Janet exhaled slowly, but the fallout came quickly. The finance director threatened to quit. Volunteers grumbled about the loss of momentum. A rival blog spun the refund as Marshall's campaign in disarray. And worst of all, the opposition pounced, calling it a failed virtue stunt. Janet stood her ground. She wrote a letter to the editor explaining the decision in full transparency. She hosted a live-stream Q&A about campaign ethics, and slowly the noise died down. But one night, as she walked past the mirror, she caught her reflection and paused. Her eyes looked sharper. Her mouth held a tension she hadn't seen in years. Not worry, but wait. This wasn't a comeback. It was a reckoning. With the part of herself that used to fight every day to hold truth to power. With the woman who had, for a while, settled into quiet evenings and muted thoughts. She missed the peace of it, but she didn't regret the fire. That weekend, Thomas held another town hall, this time outdoors, in the heart of a neighborhood that had been ignored for decades. They didn't have a stage, just a folding chair, a mic, and a shaky amp. When a teenager asked, "Why should we trust any of you? Y'all only show up when there's an election." Janet didn't flinch. She stepped forward and said, "You shouldn't, not right away. Trust is earned, so here's the deal. We show up again next month, whether we win or not, and you hold us to that." The boy smirked. "Even if you lose?" "Especially if we lose." Afterward, as the crowd began to disperse, the boy came up and said, "If you ran, I'd vote for you." Janet smiled. "Maybe someday, but right now I've got a candidate to keep in line." He laughed. "He's lucky." She looked across the lot at Thomas, shaking hands with voters, still a little awkward, still earnest. "Yeah," she said, "he is." But so was she, because she had found something she didn't know she'd lost. Not ambition, not relevance, but her power. And this time she was using it on her terms. Election night arrived under a sky the color of steel wool, heavy and uncertain. Janet stood in the back of the small community center, where the team had set up folding tables, laptops, and a screen projecting the incoming results. Coffee brewed in a corner. Volunteers hovered near the snack table, nervously grabbing pretzels they wouldn't eat. Thomas was pacing. Janet was still. She didn't believe in jinxes, but something in her resisted any hint of optimism. The numbers had been close for weeks. Too close. They'd done everything right. Transparent fundraising, powerful messaging, consistent engagement. But this was politics, and politics didn't always reward integrity. The first round of results came in. Janet barely breathed. Thomas was ahead by 39 votes. Cheers erupted in the room, but Janet held up her hand. "It's early." More precincts reported. The lead shrank, then grew, then flipped. By 10:42 p.m. it was official. Thomas had lost. By 87 votes. There was a stunned silence in the room, a soft collective deflation. Volunteers whispered. Someone cried quietly in the back. A few people started packing up without speaking. Thomas stood frozen near the projector screen, blinking slowly, his shoulders hunched like he'd been punched in the chest. Janet walked toward him. "You should speak," she said gently. He looked at her, eyes glassy. "What do I even say?" She placed a hand on his back. "Tell the truth. That's always a good place to start." He stepped up to the mic. His voice cracked on the first few words but found strength as he continued. He thanked his team, the community, and every volunteer who had believed in what politics could still be. Then he added, "I didn't win this race, but my wife reminded me that winning isn't the only way to lead." He turned, gestured toward Janet. All eyes followed. Janet hadn't expected that. She stepped forward slowly. A volunteer offered her the mic. She hesitated, then took it. "I used to think I had said everything I needed to say in my career," she began. 30 years in journalism taught me how to speak truth to power. But I forgot what it meant to speak with people, to stand next to them, not across the table." She paused, scanning the crowd. "This campaign reminded me that our voices don't retire. They just get quieter until we choose to use them again." There was a beat of silence, then applause, thunderous, rising, heartfelt, not for a win, but for something deeper. Afterward, As the crowd trickled out and volunteers hugged goodbye, a woman in her 60s approached Janet. "I didn't vote for your husband," she said, "but I listened to everything you said. And I hope you don't stop." Janet smiled. "I don't plan to." 2 weeks later, the local Women's Leadership Coalition invited her to host a public forum on civic accountability. A month after that, she was approached to lead a new initiative for empowering retired professionals to mentor grassroots movements. She didn't hesitate. She said yes. Thomas supported her with quiet pride, cooking dinners while she stayed up outlining programs, speaking on panels, and drafting op-eds again. Not as a reporter, but as a guide. She wasn't just someone's wife or a former journalist or a shadow in a back room. She had become something else entirely. A woman who had once stepped back to make space, now stepping forward because the world still needed her voice. And this time, she wasn't just behind the scenes. She was part of the story. This story reminds us that purpose doesn't have an expiration date. Janet's journey shows that even after stepping back, we can still step forward with strength, wisdom, and impact. Leadership isn't about titles, it's about using your voice when it matters most. What did you think of her transformation? Type 2 in the comments if this story inspired you, or 7 if it didn't connect with you. And if you enjoy powerful stories like this, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Ian Reddit Story for more heartfelt narratives every week.